In 1667, a navy that wasn't Britain's sailed into Britain's own backyard, up the River Medway, past the chain defenses, which they broke through like paper. And then they did something no enemy had done in living memory. They burned the English fleet at anchor, while the crews watched from the shore. The King of England sat in his palace and could do nothing. It was the greatest naval humiliation in British history. The people were furious. The treasury was empty. The country felt breakable. And it was the best thing that ever happened to Britain. Because what came next wasn't revenge. It wasn't a heroic comeback. It wasn't a better navy or a braver general. It was something far more dangerous than any of those things. An idea about money, about trust, about what happens when a small, cold, frequently humiliated island decides, quietly, without fanfare, to play an entirely different game to everyone else. This is not a story about battles. Generals and cavalry charges are almost beside the point. This is a story about a financial system, so powerful, so radical, so counterintuitive, that it turned a small, resource-poor island into the dominant force on Earth for 200 years. And the strangest part? The more Britain lost, the stronger it got. To understand why that humiliation was the best thing that ever happened, you need to understand one uncomfortable truth about power. War is expensive, and kings are terrible with money. In the 17th century, fighting a war cost roughly 10 to 15 times a nation's annual peacetime revenue. Let that sink in. Imagine your household income is £50,000 a year, and you need to spend $500,000 in the next 12 months. That's what war felt like for every European monarchy, every single time. The French solved this problem the old-fashioned way. Tax the peasants, squeeze the merchants, borrow from Italian bankers at ruinous rates, and when you can't repay, simply default. France defaulted on its debts 8 times between 1500 and 1800. 8 times. Spain was even worse. 6 sovereign defaults in a single century. This was the normal way of running a kingdom. You borrowed, you fought, you lost money, and when the bill came due, you told your creditors to go to hell. Then, you did it again. But Britain, this small, damp, frequently humiliated island, did something no one had ever done before. They paid their debts, every time, without exception. Consider what this meant in practice. A Dutch merchant in Amsterdam in 1710 could buy a British government bond, knowing with near certainty that his grandchildren would still be receiving interest payments 50 years later. No French bond offered that. No Spanish bond came close. The British bond was the only piece of paper in the world you could genuinely trust across generations. And that boring, unglamorous fact was about to become the most powerful weapon in the history of civilization. The year is 1694. England is at war with France, again. King William III is personally leading troops in Flanders, and it's going badly. The treasury is dry, the Royal Navy needs ships, the army needs supplies, and there is no money. None. Into this crisis walks a Scottish merchant named William Paterson. He is not a nobleman, not a general, not a minister of the crown. He was a trader, a man who understood money not as a symbol of power, but as a tool. And the tool he was about to propose had never been used at this scale by anyone, anywhere, in the history of the world. The idea is deceptively simple. Create a bank, not a bank for ordinary people. A bank that will lend money to the government. In exchange, the government will guarantee the interest payments. Not the king personally. That's the old system. The government, the institution, the state. The Bank of England is born, with a loan of £1.2 million at 8% interest. Now, here's where it gets clever. And this is the part most history books skip. The loan isn't just a pile of gold sitting in a vault. The bank is allowed to issue banknotes against that loan. Paper money, backed by government debt, which means the government's promise to repay has become currency. Debt has become money. Money has become trust. And trust has become power. But the bank alone isn't the revolution. The revolution is what comes next: government bonds. In 1693, Britain issues its first long-term government bond, the tontine. Within a decade, they've invented consols, bonds with no maturity date, perpetual debt. You buy a piece of paper from the British government, and it pays you interest forever. And here's the paradox that broke the old world. The more Britain borrowed, the cheaper it became to borrow. France borrows at 8, 9, sometimes 12%. Spain can barely borrow at all, but Britain, by the mid-1700s, Britain is borrowing at 3%, sometimes less. Why? Because they always paid. Because there was a parliament that guaranteed the debt, not a king who could be overthrown. Because there was a legal system that enforced contracts. Because there was a liquid market where you could sell your bonds to someone else if you needed cash. Britain didn't just borrow money, they built a system, a machine that turned trust into an unlimited war chest. What followed was 126 years of almost continuous war, and every single conflict would prove the same brutal lesson. The country with the best finances doesn't always win the first battle, but it always wins the last one. Between 1689 and 1815, Britain fought 7 major wars, 126 years of almost continuous conflict. And here's the fact that should keep every military historian awake at night. Britain lost battles constantly. They lost in the Caribbean, they lost in South America, they lost their entire American colony and the richest territory on earth. They were pushed out of Minorca, beaten at Cartagena, humiliated at Buenos Aires, and the bond market didn't care. This is the moment that separates Britain from every empire that came before it. When Spain lost a fleet, the currency collapsed. When France lost a battle, the king couldn't borrow. When the Ottomans defaulted, they lost their sovereignty. When Britain lost a battle, the interest rate barely moved because the market understood something profound. Britain wasn't betting on battles. Britain was betting on the system. The Navy could lose a ship. The Army could lose a colony. It didn't matter because the machine kept running. The taxes kept flowing. The bank kept lending. The bonds kept paying. And this created the most terrifying advantage in military history: infinite credit. While France scraped together funds for one more campaign, Britain simply issued more bonds. While Spain melted down church silver to pay soldiers, Britain printed paper backed by the full faith of Parliament. By the time of the Napoleonic Wars, Britain's national debt had reached a number that would have bankrupted any other nation on earth. 250% of GDP, 250%. Let that sit for a moment. Today, economists panic when a country's debt reaches 100% of GDP. Greece collapsed at 180%. Britain was carrying 2.5 times its entire annual economic output in debt, and still borrowing more. Every tax collector in every village, every customs officer at every port, every merchant paying duties on every cargo, they were all, in a very real sense, servicing a war machine built on paper promises. The entire productive capacity of the British Isles was the collateral. Any other country carrying that debt would have collapsed. The interest payments alone would have devoured the budget. The currency would have cratered. The government would have defaulted. Yet, Britain paid 3.5% on it and kept borrowing more. Napoleon Bonaparte conquered Europe with the greatest army ever assembled. He crushed Prussia in weeks. He humiliated Austria repeatedly. He forced Russia to the negotiating table. He could not conquer a spreadsheet. The Napoleonic Wars cost Britain approximately £831 million. To put that in perspective, that's roughly $4 trillion in today's money, the most expensive conflict in human history up to that point, and Britain financed almost all of it through bonds. Meanwhile, Napoleon had to pay cash. He couldn't borrow. Who would lend to a dictator who had already seized Swiss bank accounts, stripped the Vatican of its gold, and looted every country he conquered? Napoleon was the most brilliant military mind in history, fighting with medieval finances. He literally had to transport physical gold across a continent to pay his troops. When the gold ran out, the troops went home. Britain paid for the entire war with paper backed by trust backed by a 100-year track record of never, ever defaulting. And then Britain did something even more devastating than fighting Napoleon directly. They paid everyone else to fight him. Between 1793 and 1815, Britain paid £65.5 million in direct subsidies to European allies. In today's money, that's roughly $250 billion, spent not on British soldiers, but on other countries' armies. Think about the strategic genius of this. Britain didn't need to send its own men to die on the plains of Central Europe. It could simply write a check to Austria, and Austria would send its men instead. It could fund Prussia, and Prussia would open a second front. It could bankroll Russia, and Russia would draw Napoleon 1,000 miles from Paris, into the worst winter in a century. This is what unlimited credit actually means in practice. It doesn't mean you can buy more cannons. It means you can buy other countries' willingness to fight your wars for you. It means geography, diplomacy, and military strategy all bend toward the country that controls the money. Napoleon himself understood this. He called Britain a nation of shopkeepers. He meant it as an insult. He didn't realize it was the most accurate military assessment anyone had ever made. Britain didn't need to beat Napoleon on the battlefield. They needed to outspend him, and no one on earth could outspend a country with unlimited credit. Waterloo wasn't won by Wellington's infantry. It was won by a century of boring, reliable, unglamorous debt repayment. After Napoleon's defeat, Britain emerged with the largest empire, the strongest navy, and the most trusted currency on earth. It also emerged with a debt so large that it took 150 years to pay off. The last bonds from the Napoleonic Wars were not retired until 2015. 200 years of interest payments, honored to the penny. And that is the paradox that built the modern world. Losing battles made Britain richer, because every defeat proved the same thing. The system was stronger than any single battle. The machine didn't stop. The interest kept flowing. The trust kept deepening. Spain had gold. France had glory. The Ottomans had territory. Britain had credit. And here's the uncomfortable truth that the 19th century proved and the 20th century confirmed, and the 21st century has not yet finished teaching us. The country that controls credit controls the world, not because credit buys armies directly, though it does, but because it buys time. It buys resilience. It buys the ability to absorb losses that would destroy anyone else and keep going. America understood this. The Marshall Plan after World War II wasn't charity. It was Britain's playbook at continental scale. Lend, build dependency, create a system where your paper is the paper everyone needs. The dollar became the world's reserve currency for exactly the same reason British bonds were the world's safest investment in 1750, because America, like Britain, built institutions that made default unthinkable. And credit, boring, invisible, paper-thin credit, turned out to be the most powerful weapon ever invented. Not because it could destroy an army, but because it could build one that never runs out. The next time you hear that a government is drowning in debt, remember Britain. Remember that the most powerful empire in human history carried a debt load that would terrify a modern finance minister. And remember, it paid every penny. The question was never how much they owed. The question was always, do you trust them to pay? If this changed how you think about power, not military power, financial power, subscribe, because the next video asks a question nobody wants to answer.